Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The philosophers that we looked at last week, although they were extremely influential on all later philosophy, did not have complete systems of philosophy to offer. They had leads, individual ideas, particular observations and arguments, and of course these were accepted by many later philosophers. But these early pre-Socratics had no definitive, systematic, all-embracing approaches to philosophy that they had yet worked out. Tonight we're going to look at the first actually developed, worked out, systematic approaches to philosophy. The first attempts at complete systems, or at least overall approaches to philosophy. We're going to look at three kinds of philosophy that were formulated in Greece and endure to this day, with legions of supporters right to the present all around you, although presumably not in this room. The three kinds are materialism, skepticism, idealism. And I'll say a word at the outset defining each of these three basic approaches. Materialism is a technical term in metaphysics. It does not mean a preoccupation with money or sex. It is the view that reality is basically matter in motion, and that all so-called non-material or mental phenomena are to be explained entirely in physical, material terms. Skepticism is the view that no objective or certain knowledge of anything by anyone is possible. In other words, that what we call knowledge is really a guess, a hunch, a subjective feeling, a probability, or whatever you wish to call it, but not true knowledge. Idealism, again, is a technical term in philosophy. It does not mean devotion to the good. It is the view, again from metaphysics, that reality is basically non-material, and that the material world is not an irreducible primary, but actually simply a byproduct or expression of something more fundamental, something which is non-material in character. Now I note for the record that these are not the only possible approaches to philosophy, these three. Aristotle is no one of them, and neither is objectivism, but of that we'll say more later. Now all of these three that we're going to look at tonight are derivatives in various ways of various of the early philosophers that we looked at last week. In a way, you could say that materialism is implied by Thales' view that everything is water, since water is a form of matter. Although Thales is too early to have grasped or stated the materialist implications of his statement, and it's highly doubtful that he would have accepted materialism if he had realized that it was entailed in his statement. Materialism's major Greek spokesman are the Atomists, and that's the first school we'll look at tonight. Skepticism is primarily a derivative of Heraclitus. You remember his disciple Cratylus, who stopped speaking altogether on the grounds that there was nothing to refer to. And its major exponent is the Sophist school. They are the last pre-Platonic school. I don't call them any longer pre-Socratic because they are contemporary with Socrates in the 5th century BC. And idealism in Greece is a derivative essentially of the Pythagorean viewpoint, with a large boost or assist from Parmenides and Heraclitus. And its major exponent, of course, is Plato, helped along by certain suggestions of Socrates. Now, of these three movements, I should say at the outset, the idealism of Plato was incomparably more influential in the ancient world, in the medieval world, in the modern world, and in the 20th century than either materialism or skepticism alone or in combination have ever been. In fact, one of the great attractions that Plato offered his followers, and does till this day, was that his approach to philosophy enabled them to escape the materialist or the skeptic approaches. So we're going to look comparatively briefly first at materialism and skepticism as general background, and then begin on Plato. And now let's then turn first to the materialists, the atomists as they were called in Greece for a reason we'll see in a moment. We saw last week the problem raised by the opposition of Heraclitus and Parmenides. Everything is change and that's all that exists. There is no change, only the motionless one. And we saw the Pythagoreans attempt to solve the problem by postulating two worlds. One which is constant flux, this one, and that should satisfy Heraclitus in their view, and one which is immutable, and that should satisfy Parmenides. So there was an attempt to reconcile these two views. Now, the Atomists are the outcome of a very different kind of attempt also to reconcile Parmenides and Heraclitus. In other words, a very different attempt from the Pythagoreans. The Atomists belong to a general approach which is called pluralism, P-L-U-R-A-L, pluralism, and the name I'll explain in a moment. The Pluralists were a group of philosophers who agreed with elements of Parmenides and elements of Heraclitus as follows. They agreed with Parmenides that the stuff that makes up reality has to be uncreated, indestructible, eternal, unchanging. They agreed absolutely there can be no what is becoming what is not, or vice versa. There is no what is not. Or to put it another way, they agreed that nothing really new can ever come into or go out of existence. But they agreed with Heraclitus that there is such a thing as change, process, action, motion, becoming. And they regarded this as simply too obvious a fact to deny. The question was, how will we reconcile these two views? And they got this idea. They said, what if we abandon monism? Now, monism, remember, was the view I introduced the term last week. It is the view that there is only one world stuff, that everything, for instance, is water or air or whatever it happens to be. Suppose we abandon that view and say instead that there are many different stuffs which make up the world. And of course, the name pluralism will come from the idea of many stuffs. Let us, they said to themselves, endow each of these stuffs by itself with all the Parmenidean characteristics, so that in itself each of them is unchanging, eternal, indestructible, like a little miniature Parmenidean universe. But, they said, the one thing we'll allow these stuffs is to move around in space. That's all. We'll allow them to change their position. We'll allow locomotion as the only type of change permitted. Now, we will not therefore allow any internal alteration in the stuffs, no change in their individual qualities. And they argued locomotion doesn't violate Parmenides' principle because it doesn't require anything new to come into existence or to go out of existence. Locomotion involves simply a rearrangement of the stuffs that always exist in new combinations, a constant mixing and unmixing, as they put it, of the stuffs in different arrangements. So we will never have a case of what is becoming what is not, or vice versa. We are going to then explain every other kind of change exclusively as being actually, in reality, a process of changing position and therefore changing rearrangements of these unchanging stuffs. If you want to think of it this way, we'll take Parmenides 1 and smash it into a bunch of separate little stuffs. And we will explain all change, growth, becoming, development as merely a process in which these eternal stuffs constantly shift around and rearrange themselves. So we won't need any reference to non-existence as the beginning or the end of the process of change. And the key point will be nothing new ever comes into existence. Well, of course, the question was, what are these many stuffs? Now, the early pluralists are primarily of historical interest. The first advocate of this approach was a man called Empedocles, E-M-P-E-D-O-C-L-E-S, who was 490 to 435 BC. And he was not very original in his concept of what the stuffs were. He just picked up the various stuffs of his predecessors and combined them into one view. So he said there were four basic kinds of stuff, four roots, as he called it: earth, air, water, and fire. And everything else was merely combinations and rearrangements of these four. So much for Empedocles. I mean, he had a clever idea, but it's not worth spending time on here. Now, he had a successor, Anaxagoras, A-N-A-X-A-G-O-R-A-S, who was born around 500 BC, who disagreed with him. Also a pluralist, but he argued as follows. He said to Empedocles, in effect, you say there is supposed to be nothing new coming into existence. You say that on your philosophy, you never have what is not becoming what is. But I don't see it. As far as I can tell, on your viewpoint, you are violating Parmenides' basic principle all the time. Consider, for instance, tomatoes, or bananas, or tobacco, or chalk, or flesh, or hair, and so on. Now, you say that these things are formed when earth, air, and so on get into different combinations. But even so, all these things I mentioned are different from earth, air, water, and fire. They have different qualities. They have different tastes and different colors and different sounds and different odors. So something new is actually coming into existence. When various changes take place, banana taste comes into existence, and then when the banana disintegrates, it goes out of existence, and so on. He said we have to really be consistent here. If there are truly to be no new qualities in reality, and that's the basic Parmenidean principle, there has to be way more than 4 stuffs. There has to be an indefinite number of stuffs. There have to be as many different stuffs as there are different types of things. There has to be tomato stuff with its distinctive qualities, and banana stuff, flesh stuff, hair stuff, tobacco stuff, etc., etc. And each of these will have to be regarded as irreducible, inexplicable in terms of anything else, a basic ingredient of reality. Now, he said, if we take this view and we say little tiny bits of all of these stuffs are actually in everything, little seeds, as he put it, of all these stuffs are actually in everything. And you might say, well, but I don't see banana stuff and tomato stuff when I look at somebody's hair. And of course the answer would be only little seeds are there, and your senses are too gross to detect them. Your senses deceive you. You only see the dominant stuff. But suppose that little bits, little seeds were of everything, was in everything. Then, he says, change would really only be a rearrangement, and nothing new would ever come into existence. If we burned wood, for instance, and converted it to ash, well, there wouldn't be new qualities coming into existence because the ash stuff was always in the wood to begin with, and all that happened is a certain rearrangement made us able to perceive the ash stuff and temporarily obscured the wood stuff, which is still there, and so on for all changes. This, he said, is the only thing to do if we're to obey Parmenides' principle. On the other hand, this was a total dead end from the task undertaken by Thales. It was a total collapse, because Thales wanted to find unity in the midst of diversity. He wanted to find the one in the many, and here we end up with diversity, with the many as absolutely irreducible and inexplicable. It's a hopeless theory, which would be the end of science. All you can say about tomatoes is they're made of tomato stuff, and so on for everything else. And yet it seemed to follow from Empedocles if you're going to be consistent with Parmenides. At this point, the atomists enter the scene. Now, the 2 famous atomists are Leucippus, Leucippus, who lived sometime in the 6th century BC, and almost nothing is known of him. And therefore, the much more famous one is Democritus, Democritus, who, as far as we can tell, lived a whole century, from 460 to 360 BC. Now, they were also pluralists, these two, the atomist school. They agreed that the world was composed of many elements, each of them by itself too tiny to see, and that all change was merely the mixing and unmixing, the rearranging of these elements. But they said, Anaxagoras' theory is hopeless. What can we do to get out of it? Well, they came up with a theory which was destined to be fantastically influential. They said we have to distinguish 2 kinds of characteristics which physical things possess. 2 basically different kinds of characteristics: the qualities and the quantities. The qualitative characteristics versus the quantitative or mathematical or numerical characteristics. Now, in the qualities were included things like colors, red, orange, yellow, etc. Sounds, loud, soft, etc. Odors, you can think of examples. Tastes, temperatures, warm, cold, etc. Texture, rough, smooth, etc. Those are the qualities. In the quantities are the attributes which are mathematically measurable. And here you see an obvious influence of the Pythagoreans. And they include size, the exact amount of extension of a given particle. Shape, is it triangular or rectangular or what? Motion or rest, and at what rate? Is it standing still or is it moving? And if so, at what rate? And number. Is a thing one particle or is there 10 particles making up a peach or whatever? Those are the big four of the quantities: size, shape, state of motion, and number. Now, on the basis of this distinction, they said there is only one way out of Anaxagoras' dilemma. And that is to strip qualities from the things in the world altogether. To say that the things in the physical world actually only have quantitative characteristics, actually only have size, shape, motion, and number. Because they say if you say that qualities, as they have just defined it, if you say that qualities like colors, odors, tastes, temperatures, and so on are real, then you've got two choices and it's disaster either direction. Either you have to say some of them are real, but not all. And that's, in principle, the position of Empedocles. Some qualities are real and not the rest. But then the others emerge, come into existence, and go out of existence, and that's forbidden by Parmenides. Or else you have to say all qualities are real. All are equally basic and eternal, and that's Anaxagoras' position, which is hopeless. Well, our only alternative, if we're to escape the disasters implicit in saying some qualities are real or all qualities are real, is to say no qualities are real. We'll say that reality in itself is exclusively quantitative. The various stuffs that make it up in themselves have only size, shape, motion, number. What we call qualities are simply the way that what's really out there affects us. They are merely the subjective effects on human beings, merely the way things appear to us. And if we take that view, they said, we will be able to explain change without violating Parmenides. When wood becomes ash, no new qualities are taking place in reality, because in reality there aren't any qualities at all. The appearance of new qualities is simply taking place in our minds as a result of different rearrangements of purely quantitative particles out there in the world. Therefore, reality consists of a huge, actually infinite number of tiny stuffs or particles possessing only these quantitative features. Now, what will we call them, these particles? Well, each of them is absolutely Parmenidean. It's a little tiny Parmenidean one. It's absolutely solidly packed within any given particle. It's a plenum, if you remember that term, completely full. There's no little holes in it. So if you tried to get the point of a knife or even a needle into one of these particles, you couldn't do it because it's solidly packed. It's completely uncuttable. And since the Greek for uncuttable is atome, it came out that these little particles are atoms. And therefore, they took the view that all change is nothing but spatial change of atomic position. And thus the name Atomists, which now supersedes pluralism because the old pluralists just fell into disrepute. This became the sophisticated form of pluralism. Now the question comes, how do you differentiate one atom from another? Since they're all have no qualities at all, what makes one atom and separates it from another? And the answer was, well, there must be empty space between them. Because if there was no empty space, it was all one solidly packed mash of atoms, then it would be the same as one big atom. In other words, we'd be back to Parmenides 1. Therefore, over and above atoms, there has to be the empty spaces between them. And therefore, they said there are two constituents that make up reality: atoms and, as they called it, the void. The void being the empty spaces which separate the atoms. Now, of course, the void is a crude violation of Parmenides' principle. It's a blatant what is not sitting out there as a constituent of reality. They tried to get around it by saying, oh no, it isn't a violation of Parmenides. It's just that there's two kinds of reality: full reality and empty reality. But that's pretty crummy way out. In any event, the universe is atoms in the void, and that's all. Now, how do these atoms operate? What determines how they behave? And their answer was they operate exclusively as a result of physical pressure and impact from other atoms and their physical reaction accordingly. They smash each other and collide strictly according to the laws of mechanics. Of course, they didn't know the laws of mechanics in those days, but what we would now call the laws of mechanics. And this is sometimes referred to as the billiard ball metaphysics. If you imagine a person has shot the balls, broken them up, and they are now just roaming back and forth, smashing each other and moving back and forth strictly by mechanistic law. Well, according to the atomists, everything operates that way. Everything that happens, happens exclusively according to the laws of mechanics. Which means, first of all, nothing ever happens by chance. They were opposed altogether to the idea that something causeless could happen. Everything is determined by the atomic configurations and the various pressures and reactions, by mechanical law. It means, secondly, they said, that nothing ever happens for a purpose or an end or a goal. Because atoms, or billiard balls, if you want to think of that analogy, do not move around in order to get into the side pocket. They move around simply as a result of the forces operating upon them. In other words, the laws of mechanics. They have no purposes, no goals. Now, you may be tempted to think, well, billiard balls move that way, but the man who wields the cue was motivated by a different principle of behavior. He had a purpose, whether it's to enjoy himself or show off his skill or make money or pass the time or whatever it happens to be. But you see, if you are an atomist and you subscribe to this philosophy, you say the man wielding the cue operates on exactly the principle that the billiard balls do once he's hit them. He also is a quivering system of atoms. Certain atoms struck him in the appropriate places, and that caused parts of his body to start quivering, and that caused him to pick up the cue, and that caused and so, and at a certain point, the motion is communicated to the balls, which start to jostle back and forth, and then they hit the table, and others jostle, and so on, and so on, and so on, and that's it. Now, a metaphysics such as this is called technically mechanistic materialism. Now, each of those words has a meaning. Materialism I've already defined as the view that matter is the fundamental reality, and that anything non-material is simply a derivative or byproduct to be explained entirely in physical terms. Mechanism is the view that everything happens according to the laws of mechanics. In other words, it is contrasted with the view known as teleology, T-E-L-E-O-L-O-G-Y. Teleology is the idea that purpose is operative somewhere in the universe. Now, teleologists do not agree among themselves where. A religious teleologist will say the universe as a whole has a purpose, and everything has a purpose. A more naturalistic type of teleologist will say no, only certain parts of the universe has a purpose. For instance, only living creatures, or only conscious creatures, or conceivably only just human beings are governed by purpose. But in any event, the mechanists deny purpose on any level, anywhere. There simply is no such thing. Purposeful behavior is a myth. That is the essence of the meaning of the metaphysics of mechanistic materialism. And these are the first mechanistic materialists in history. Now, since this is put forth as a metaphysics, it encompasses everything, and therefore including man, as I've just indicated. It follows, therefore, that man is governed by strict, rigid determinism. Determinism is implied by materialism because, of course, there's no mind to make any choices. And it's implied by mechanism, since everything happens according to the laws of mechanics. So they're double determinists. They are the first orthodox, systematic, principled, self-conscious determinists in philosophic history. Now, if you ask them, well, but don't you believe in any such thing as a mind or a soul? They say, oh, yes, we believe in a soul, but the soul is made of soul atoms. And it's the presence of those particular atoms that give rise to life and consciousness. I might mention they also believed in gods. apparently because people dreamed of gods, and at this primitive time they thought if something appears to you in a dream, it must have some counterpart in reality. But the gods, they insisted, were also made of atoms. They eventually perished the same way human beings did. They had no divine characteristics. They were indifferent to men. And at a certain point, their various atoms simply split up and went off in new combinations, and that was the end of the gods. So for practical purposes, atomists are atheists, although you will find that they believed in gods of an utterly unreligious and insignificant kind. Now that the soul atoms, I stress, are completely physical. On this philosophy, you could have a good handful of soul. Soul atoms are fine, round, smooth, polished, mobile, they said. They are diffused throughout the world. When a cluster of them enter a combination of grosser atoms and start quivering, then you have a living, or, if it's appropriately organized, a conscious entity. Consciousness is nothing but a quivering of the soul atoms. Periodically, you have a slight deficiency of them. A few of them exit. That's called going to sleep. Sometimes there's a sudden exodus during the day. That's fainting. And at a certain point, all of them leave permanently. That's dying. Of course, there is no such thing as immortality on this philosophy. Death is disintegration, after which there is no you left at all. Your various atomic constituents wander off according to the laws of mechanics to take part in new combinations, and you are obliterated, and that's the end, since you are simply the combination. So much for the metaphysics of the atomists. What about their epistemology? Well, I'll mention only one point here, namely their attitude to the senses. You remember that Heraclitus thought the senses were invalid and distinguished between reality and appearance. And so on his own grounds did Parmenides and the Pythagoreans. The senses deceive us. Well, the atomists hold the identical view. They hold that you cannot rely on the senses. Why? Well, judging by the senses, it appears that things have colors. Nothing seems clearer to me than that this tablecloth is green. And yet, in reality, we know, if this theory is correct, there are no colors. Green is a subjective effect on me. Nothing seems clearer than that this feels cool. And yet, we know that there are no temperatures in reality. Nothing seems clearer than that I'm hearing a sound now, namely my own voice, but there are no sounds. And there are no tastes, and there are no textures. All there is size, shape, and so on. Therefore, the senses are deceptive. Now, Democritus uses the term convention to, he copied that from the sophist school, to stand for anything which is a product of man's subjective constitution as against the actual facts of reality. The Greeks frequently contrasted what came from convention and what came from nature or reality. And using that terminology, Democritus says in a famous quotation, quote, "By convention, sweet is sweet. By convention, bitter is bitter. By convention, hot is hot. By convention, cold is cold. By convention, color is color. But in reality, there are atoms in the void. That is, the objects of sense are supposed to be real, and it is customary to regard them as such. But in truth, they are not. Only the atoms in the void are real," unquote. So the atomists subscribe to the same dichotomy between reality, known by reason, and appearance, known by the senses. So they simply carry out the same thing that we've seen in many other cases. And they, too, therefore, are philosophically rationalists. Now, those of you who know any modern philosophy will know that this distinction of the atomists between what they called qualities and quantities, although it never went anywhere in the ancient and medieval world, was picked up at the time of the Renaissance by almost all the influential scientists and philosophers. It was picked up by and accepted by Galileo, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, and Locke gave it its modern name. He called it, instead of calling it qualities versus quantities, he called it the primary versus the secondary qualities. The primary being the quantities, the secondary being the subjective effects on us, in his view. And it was also, by all these philosophers, made the basis for invalidating the senses. So we're going to encounter it again. Its source is the Greek atomists, and it's enormously influential when we get to modern philosophy. And I'm going to leave it for now. It's a complex issue to untangle what is wrong with it. There are several different factors involved, and I'm going to present the objectivist view on this question at a time when you will be eager to know the answer if you're not already, because you will see the catastrophes that derive in the modern world from this distinction. But I suggest that you keep a list of issues I have promised to present the objectivist view on by the end of the course. The number one is, what is wrong with the distinction between primary and secondary qualities? I do want to make one final comment before we leave atomism, however, about its metaphysics. Do not be misled by the primitive idea of atoms here, because in more sophisticated forms, this theory is enormously common today. It's all over the place, particularly among psychologists who are desperate to be regarded as scientific and who regard that as requiring that they be materialists. Perhaps the arch example is B.F. Skinner, but there are many, many others. Today, of course, they don't talk about soul atoms, but they talk, what they agree with in relation to the atomists is the view that we can explain all human behavior without reference to mind or consciousness. We can simply do without consciousness, write it off as just the workings of matter. And then, of course, they all disagree among themselves whether the relevant parts of matter are genes or electric charges or SR, stimulus response connections, or reflexes or super reflexes, etc., and so on. But that is all irrelevant philosophically. It's merely subtler forms of the Democritean theory. Philosophically, however, it is identical to Democritus. Scientifically, it's more sophisticated, but philosophically, it's identical. Now, as for what is wrong with mechanistic materialism as a philosophy, I'm going to have to refer you to some readings if you're interested. I'd refer you first to Miss Rand's article on Skinner in the Ayn Rand letter. You can look at a book by W.T. Jones, History of Western Philosophy, Volume 1, which has a chapter on atomism, which presents many of the criticisms that are applicable to it. I could recommend a book by Bran Blanchard called The Nature of Thought, which has a very good chapter attacking and dissecting behaviorism, behaviorism being simply the name of mechanistic materialism as applied to modern psychology. And I might also recommend a book by J.B. Pratt called Matter and Spirit, which has many, many things wrong with it, but also has many, many good points attacking materialism. Now, as a theory of physics, not metaphysics, but physics, mechanistic materialism was a brilliant idea. And in fact, modern science began when somebody got the idea of combining Democritus with Pythagoras. That is, of looking for mechanistic laws which were mathematically formulatable. But they didn't get that till the Renaissance, as we'll see when we get there. But as a metaphysics, it is completely invalid because it denies the existence of mind. And as such, it's immediately self-refuting, as its opponents have pointed out from antiquity to the present day. If there's no such thing as a mind capable of observing evidence and reasoning according to the laws of logic, then every man's conclusions express nothing but blind mechanistic reactions. Each man is then a machine. He's a physical puppet guided by the laws of motion. His conclusions are dictated by factors such as the density of his tongue, the viscosity of his saliva, the charges coursing through his nervous system, etc. He's a little billiard ball system, in effect, rattling and quivering by mechanistic necessity. No one on this philosophy, therefore, could ever claim to be guided by logic, by reason, by evidence, because there's no mind to grasp, to think, to relate the evidence. How, then, is anyone to decide which of all the conflicting positions on all the different subjects is true? The situation is this. You rattle the way you have to rattle, and I quiver the way I have to quiver, and that's it. No one can say his position is knowledge, simply that that's the way he has to quiver. In other words, materialism entails skepticism, and in that respect is self-refuting. You couldn't even know that materialism was true if you didn't have a mind to acquire knowledge. Now, there are many other objections, and you can consult the books that I mentioned. And if you wish, I would be very happy in the question period to expound at some length 3 or 4 random further objections to materialism if you want an arsenal of objections. But I'll wait to be asked in the question period if you want. Please give some additional argument against mechanistic materialism. The first question to ask is, what is the argument in favor of materialism? What is to defend that? Now, if you take an unprejudiced view of reality, if you truly are going to go by observation, you observe that there's an external world and an internal world. You have direct awareness of matter on the outside and of consciousness in your own head. Now, the standard materialist, the low-grade materialist will say, and the low-grade can, of course, have chairs at Harvard. Standard materialists will say, I don't know what you're talking about when you talk about consciousness or mind. I can't taste it. I can't feel it. I can't weigh it. I can't dissect it. Now I can crack open your head and stick my fingers in your brain. That's good, solid, and physical. I can have a brain sandwich. But I can't find any mind. See, and therefore it's a myth. Now that argument, in actual fact, is fantastic. What it consists of doing is setting up the characteristics of matter as the criterion of reality, and then saying, since mind doesn't have those characteristics, it isn't real. Well, if that method of reasoning were valid, you could do exactly the same thing in reverse. You can make a list of all the things that matter doesn't have. Now, for instance, you can't psychoanalyze electrons or matter. You can discuss their motivation. You can discuss its feelings, its sensations, its premises, etc. Now, suppose I were to say, since you can't do any of this with matter, obviously matter doesn't exist, only mind. Your immediate answer would be, how can you take characteristics of consciousness and arbitrarily say all of reality must fulfill it, when there's obviously 2 kinds of things? Now, the same principle applies equally to matter. Then, of course, the materialist will come back and he'll say, yeah, but you can't define consciousness. All you can do is give synonyms. You can say consciousness is awareness, so on. Or list its properties, but you can't say what is it. To which the answer is, in exactly that same way, you're in that position with regard to matter. You can give synonyms. You can say it's material, it's physical, it's extended, but you cannot define it in terms of other concepts any more than you can consciousness. All definitions presuppose some cognitive primaries, which are the basic categories in terms of which you define everything else, but which themselves cannot be reduced back further. In effect, the axioms of definition. And there is every reason to hold that consciousness as a phenomenon is simply descriptively different from matter, and consequently that you cannot do any more than say, if you want to know what I mean by consciousness, you point ostensibly the same way you do with matter, or with green for that matter. Now, how would you communicate green to someone who didn't know? You'd have to point to several instances and say that's green. That's what's called an ostensive definition, and a definition by pointing. And it's the way all primaries are defined. How would you define existence? Same thing. Since everything exists, you can't distinguish existence from anything else. The only way you define existence is just wave your arm and say it's that, covering everything. And the same principle is applicable to consciousness. Not that it covers everything, but that you grasp it by direct introspection. Now, I remind you of the crucial point that we have to distinguish what philosophy can do and what science can do. I and objectivism put forth no theories on the ultimate relationship between matter as we now know it and consciousness. It might be the case, I say it might be simply that I'm not ruling this out, that consciousness is a phenomenon which results from a certain enormous complexity of organization of matter, and in that sense is a derivative phenomenon. It might be the case that there is simply, irreducibly, consciousness and matter as 2 distinct phenomena which in some form always exist and combine in certain ways under appropriate conditions. It might be the case that there is a 3rd or a 10th phenomenon that we yet do not know, of which matter is one product and consciousness is another, or one form and another. some world stuff as yet outside our knowledge, some type of energy. I don't know. Nobody knows, and nobody has any business speculating in the state of our present knowledge. Nor will philosophy have any means of answering this question. That'll be a question to be answered by the appropriate scientific discoveries in physics, biology, psychology. I don't prejudge those questions. I simply say, on philosophic grounds, you cannot get away from the following. One, there is consciousness which is not reducible to matter as we now understand the phenomenon of matter. It has its own characteristics and its own method of being known. And it is as real a phenomenon as external physical matter. Two, the conclusions of consciousness are efficacious. They have effects on the actual behavior of conscious entities. Three, consciousness is, in the human case, volitional. Now, the proof of these, of course, these latter points, I assume you know from objectivist literature, and I won't get into them. Those are the points on the mind-body question which are philosophically untouchable. Now, the ultimate physical or metaphysical interrelations of the two, I don't know, and it makes no difference. Philosophically, it makes no difference. Now, pursuing materialism for a moment, it comes in two varieties. One is called reductive materialism, and the other is called epiphenomenalism. Reductive materialism is the crudest type. That's the type, you know, that says thinking is nothing but a quivering of the brain cells. Love is a squirting of glandular juices, etc. Now, this is a crude confusion of necessary condition and identity. Maybe it's true that certain glands have to squirt before you can experience love. That does not mean that love is its necessary condition. Obviously, it has to be something different from the thing which gives rise to it or is presupposed by it. Now, as one philosopher put it, you cannot argue with a man who says love is a squirting of juices. That's distinct from love is caused by or presupposes, but love literally is. Because he said to argue against a position, what you try and do is show that it leads to an absurdity. But if somebody comes in the room and utters an absurdity as his formal position, there is nothing you can say. If somebody comes in and says, my view is that elephants are peaches, now do something. Now that's reductive materialism. Now the more serious form of materialism is epiphenomenalism. And that is the view that there is such a thing as mind which is distinct from matter. Only. It's completely a helpless byproduct of matter. It is incapable of initiating any action. It's a passive resultant of physical processes. It's completely determined, completely purposeless. Sort of like a useless waste product that nature gives off. Now, the problems with this are all of the problems that we indicated and even more. If mind is metaphysically helpless and has no efficacy or effect, then the theory is right away self-refuting. The advocates of it are mindless by their own statement, or rather they have a useless mind that has no effects, and therefore their mind had nothing to do with the motion of their hands or their tongues as they were busy propounding their theory. Of course, insofar as there's no mind, there's no possibility of choice, and therefore materialism necessarily implies determinism, and that, as you must know from objectivist literature, is thoroughly self-refuting. The determinist can know anything, including that he's determined. And insofar as it implies a denial of purpose, it's also self-refuting. That means there's no way in principle of distinguishing between a man whose hand shakes because of palsy and a man whose hand shakes because he wants to express a certain thought, because there's no such thing as wanting to express. Everything that happens is purposeless. It's simply mechanistically caused. Well, if that's the case, no one has a right to expect you to consider the results of his palsied shaking. Now, beyond all of these, there is a simple fact. And it's often very helpful to appeal to facts in philosophy. It is not a common practice, but it's a very desirable one. Now, I put it to you that you cannot look at the actual facts of the world and entertain for a moment the idea that ideas, mental phenomena, have no effects, which is the essence of materialism. You could not account for the facts of human behavior, the obvious facts that their behavior is dictated by their ideas, including their value judgments, that when they change their values, they change their action, that they go to psychotherapists in order to change their mental processes, in order, therefore, to act differently, that that's the only way they can do it. That knowledge is a vital necessity, without which a man cannot cross the street or satisfy the most minimal hunger pains, and that knowledge means something mental, the acquisition of awareness, of ideas, of information. You could not begin to make sense of human history from the Industrial Revolution through the self-flagellation of the worst medieval saint on mechanistic materialist grounds that somehow, in some funny way, the atom started to quiver and St. Francis went out and plunged himself in a snow heap every time he had a sexual desire. I mean, it's just bizarre. Now, I don't want to kill the whole period on that, but I regard mechanistic materialism as simply senseless. I think Plato's philosophy is infinitely more sophisticated, more thoughtful, much better reasoned. It's wrong, but I'd take Plato over a materialist any day. Is mechanism valid in physics? Part of the same question. Well, if all you mean by mechanism is the denial of teleology as applied to inanimate nature, then I would say yes. In other words, objectivism does not subscribe to the idea that the inanimate world is animated by purpose. It holds that purpose is coextensive with consciousness and is therefore possible at most to the animals and, of course, primarily in the form of a conceptually directed goal to man. In this broad respect, objectivism would subscribe to mechanism in physics. However, as soon as you become more specific than that, and you mean by mechanism Galileo's laws or Newton's laws or Einstein's laws or whichever particular scientist is going to tell you what are the principles by which matter operates, that's a question for science, not for philosophy. Are there any non-mechanistic materialists or non-materialistic mechanists? Well, let's take it one at a time. Are there any non-mechanistic materialists? Yes, the Marxists. The Marxists are dialectic materialists, not mechanistic materialists. As materialists, they agree that reality is essentially matter in motion. But as dialectic advocates, they do not believe that the laws controlling the development of matter are simply the good old-fashioned laws of Galilean mechanics or Newtonian mechanics. They believe that the laws controlling the entire world are Hegel's dialectic triad. Something happens and then the opposite and then the two blend, which gives rise to a new opposite and so on, and the reality waltzes to destiny. That's a very different type of materialism. It's not mechanistic materialism. Are there non-materialistic mechanists? I can't imagine what they would consist of. If mechanism is the view that everything operates according to the laws of mechanics, I don't know what else would obey the laws of mechanics other than material things. And if everything occupies that way, presumably then everything is material, so I can't imagine it in reverse. Is it within the province of philosophy to determine the status of consciousness? That is, whether it is a separate substance or entity, or a state, or attribute, or action of certain living entities? If this is a philosophic question, what is the answer? The only respect in which this is a philosophic question is consciousness must, in some respect, have at least one attribute of an entity. That is, it must be capable of initiating action. It must be capable of that if we are to preserve the philosophic principle of the efficacy of consciousness and its ability to direct human behavior or animal behavior. And in that one respect, it must be akin to an entity. But what its exact status is and its exact relation, on anything further than that, philosophy has nothing to say.